I'm so excited to introduce this next speaker tonight. I've been lucky enough to experience the energy he brings to his work and the passion he has for sharing the history of El Salvador and its people. I first met Francisco in 2019 when I traveled to El Salvador for Alternative Break trip. Plug. If you are not already signed up for Alternative Break, please talk to Amanda. Amanda, raise your hand, please. There we go. An Alternative Break trip that was designed in partnership between Marian University and CRISPAZ. Several of the students who were on that trip are actually here with us tonight to hear Francisco speak. Grace, if you are here, I do maintain that I only tripped. Working with Francisco was one of the highlights of my time in El Salvador, and I am so grateful that he's agreed to speak here tonight, though I'm not entirely sure he was prepared for the 54-degree temperature drop. Since 2009, Francisco has served as the executive director at CRISPAZ, an ecumenical faith-based organization dedicated to building bridges of solidarity between the Church of the Poor and marginalized communities in El Salvador and communities in the U.S., Canada, Australia, and other countries. CRISPAZ strives for peace, justice, and human liberation. As an organization, they are politically nonpartisan and committed to nonviolence. In his role as the executive director of CRISPAZ, Francisco shares the Salvadoran experience with visiting delegations and serves as a cultural ambassador, helping to connect people around the world to a common vision of a more just and peace world. Please join me in welcoming Francisco Mena Ugarte.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, so I come from El Salvador, where it is actually warm and nice. Not being facetiously, it's been a welcome change to have this temperature. We don't have temperatures like this throughout the year. We typically say that El Salvador only has 2 seasons, hot and hotter. So this is very different. So thank you, President Elsner, for welcoming me to the university. Thank you, Adriana, for the invitation as part of this series of speakers. I want to share a little bit about El Salvador, and through the history of CRISPAZ, I do a little bit of that. There's a lot that I can say, but there's a few elements that I've decided to keep in my presentation that relate to our countries. El Salvador is pretty far away from specifically the Indianapolis area, and El Salvador, you do have to take a plane, and it takes a while to get there. So one could argue, how is this related to El Salvador? So I've kept in my presentations the things that unite us, the things that connect us in good ways and in bad ways. CRISPAZ is a witness of that reality. So I want to share a little bit of the history of CRISPAZ, like I said. And the second part, I want to focus more on what you probably read there that says radical hope. So what does that mean? But I want to give you the context of where this radical hope happens. Christians for Peace in El Salvador is a faith-based organization. It was founded in 1984 by 3 religious persons, 3 U.S. citizens, a Quaker peace activist from Alaska, a Lutheran pastor from Texas, and a Carmelite priest from Texas. This sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it's not. It's how CRISPAZ was founded. It was founded by these 3 people who gravitated around the area of Central America during the late 70s and 80s when terrible things were happening. And while they were in Nicaragua, they knew what was happening in El Salvador and came to El Salvador and were not prepared for the levels of violence they had observed, and felt that they had to do something. They would travel back to the United States and share some of these stories with people. I forgot I can take my mask off right now. It might be easier for you all to hear me as well. So this is kind of the origin of CRISPAZ in this vision that they saw right when they arrived to El Salvador, and were, like I said, surprised, and that's a light word, with the violence that they saw. There were 3 specific events that, I have to come back here. This is El Salvador, by the way. El Salvador is roughly the size of New Jersey, the state New Jersey, so it's very, very small. But as you can see, it's right in a part of Central America where it becomes thinner before it becomes wider, and it turns into other countries and eventually comes into South America. But we're very close to Cuba as you can see. So geopolitically, El Salvador has been a perfect place for the U.S. to set base to a certain degree. And this is one of the reasons that we're connected in different ways, like I said. El Salvador went through a civil war that lasted from 1981 to 1992. And at the very beginning of this war, there were a few incidents that really marked the lives of many individuals in my country, but also the 3 U.S. citizens that founded CRISPAZ. And it was the knowledge of this massacre that took place in a river called Rio Sumpul. This happened a few months before the war began in El Salvador. Over 300 civilians lost their lives, and in this place there were children, there were women and men. Many people drowned as they were trying to cross the river. On one side of the river is Honduras, on the other side is El Salvador, and both the Salvadoran army and the Honduran army participated in this massacre. And these massacres were not only done to take life, they were also done to leave a message. So without getting too graphic here, things were done to the bodies, and they were left in ways so people could be deterred from speaking out against the injustices that were happening. So again, it wasn't as if taking life was enough, but the dignity of the corpse was even beyond, I don't know what word to use here, but it was, they still did more than just kill, if that even makes sense. The second event that they learned about was El Mozote. El Mozote is a small village in the northern part of El Salvador, and in this village there was an operation the days of December 11 and December 12 in 1981, where 700 people were killed there. I was about to say lost their lives, but their lives were taken. The area that you see here your right, that's where bones were found after Argentinian anthropologists came and did the digging of the remains. And the numbers there, like I said, were over 700 people who lost their lives. 60% of them were under the ages of 12. So 60% of the people that were killed that day or those 2 days, actually, they started with the man, then they killed the women, and then eventually killed the children. So 60% of those children that were killed there were under the ages of 12, younger than anyone in this room, right? So some of them were months old. Some of the mothers were still breastfeeding when this happened. And the bullets that killed these individuals said made in the USA. So as U.S. citizens, the founders of CRISPAZ felt extremely upset in knowing this, and again, continued to visit El Salvador and then take these stories back. The third event is the knowledge of the School of the Americas. Are you all familiar with the School of the Americas? Who's not familiar with the School of the Americas? Okay, so at the beginning of the School of the Americas, you see that it has something, right? It says U.S. Army School of the Americas. It was in Panama at the beginning, and this is why this emblem is in Spanish, and it's something that we have all heard, all for one, and all for one for all, and all for one. That's what that says right there in Spanish. This was a military base founded in the 40s in Panama. Can you hear me okay still? Can you hear me okay? There. Okay. Let me close this. There. So it was founded in Panama in the 40s and became infamously known for what it is known today in the 60s, when it began to receive Latin American soldiers and officers to be trained on various disciplines related to the career of someone being in the Army. But it also got involved in two things specifically in Latin America. One of them was teaching torture, and the second one was counterinsurgency tactics, teaching counterinsurgency tactics. And basically what the School of the Americas was doing was making sure that they aligned themselves with certain governments in Latin America and protect the status quo through military repression. And if you go through the list of human rights atrocities in Latin America, first of all, you can go through Argentina. You know, they had a military dictatorship. Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Mexico. What a lot of these people have in common, these people that went on to lead a lot of these different events, is that they were graduates of the School of the Americas. So the School of the Americas has now changed its name. It's called WINSIC, and it is in Fort Benning, Georgia. And the School of the Americas, under this name, the School of the Americas, moved to Fort Benning, Georgia, and that's where it did a lot of the training as well. But the beginning of it was in the 40s in Panama, and then later in the 60s when it began to receive many Salvadoran officers. In this School of the Americas, and I want to tie this to the two previous massacres so you can understand why the founders of CRISPAZ did what they did. In the School of the Americas, they would have an example like this, and there would be a class similar to this one, and there would be a question that would be asked. What is the most efficient way to get rid of this fish? Right? What is the most efficient way to get rid of this fish? Now, we can spend a few minutes here trying to find out what the best answer is, and I'm sure there could be many answers. The instructor, the military instructor, would make sure people understood what the most efficient way to get rid of a fish was. And as you know, the Army is not interested in your opinion. If they're interested in your opinion, then they just give it to you, right? So the instructor would go on to say the most efficient way to get rid of this fish is to remove the element that gives life to it. So what do? We drain the water. Once the water is gone, we can add another fish. We can add 3 more fish, but the fish will not survive. And this is how we will have gotten rid of the fish in the most efficient way. This was not left as a metaphor for the officers to go back and say, you know, what was this guy talking about? This would be clearly spelled out. In communities where you have individuals that know very well what their neighbors are beginning to suffer, what injustices are affecting them, they begin to organize around these issues, to call out the companies or individuals that are causing the injustices. They began to understand that the injustices aren't these things that just fall from the sky. There are people behind them causing them. And in El Salvador, we had very few landowners who could control what was happening in El Salvador. They can control the status quo, and they were making sure that these things were not being touched. So when people demanded more money, when people demanded better working conditions, they could just say no. And they had the Army to back them up. So going back to this example, in communities that knew that certain families were struggling because of the injustices, and then found that other families who they've known forever were also struggling with injustices, they began to say, no, you know, this is not enough. We need to organize around these issues and demand for a change. When this began to happen in ways that were visible and could be heard, the Army would be called in. And the Army would see this as a problem of a fish in a fishbowl. They would see those individuals that were creating the organization, that were organizing the individuals, as the fish, and the community as the reason why they did this, the reason why they cared. It was the values that they have obtained throughout their lives came from this community. So this is why they were upset that these injustices were happening. So what would happen? They would target the village as well. So they would go into the village and eliminate everything. This would be including women, men, children, etc., etc. One of the other things that was, I think, particularly cruel was that, and this was spelled out just the way that I'm going to say it to you, any child in this community is a potential guerrilla fighter, is a potential rebel. So he or she needs to be dealt with as well. So this final piece, I would say, among many pieces, these three pieces really motivated these three U.S. citizens to speak up against what they believed was not within the values of the United States. I know this particular story of the fish in the fishbowl because my father is a former officer of the Salvadoran Army who was trained twice as a cadet at the School of the Americas. Once as a cadet, and then later as an officer. And he shared this story along with many others that he was a part of and kind of classes that he took. So this particular story, like I said, I didn't Google it or I didn't hear it from someone. Well, I did hear it from someone, but my dad, right, who was there. El Salvador had a lot of money controlled in a very small amount of people that controlled what would happen and the status quo. And the army was the tool that they used to get these things done. There was a lot of repression that began to happen during the late 70s when people began to organize around these different issues that were happening, and the army was the way that the government responded. The way that any type of conversation would end up is by sending the army. The army was the solution to all the problems. If there was no schools, there were no health, people would go out and protest. The government would not sit down with them and say, let's see what we can do. No, they would just send out the army, and these massacres began to happen. I shared two massacres with you, the one in Rio Sumpul and the other one El Mozote. These are two among over 100 massacres that took place in El Salvador during the Civil War. I'll leave here for a second. So during the 90s, during the 80s, one of the things that CRISPAZ became a witness to was this reality that I just shared with you. You know, the bullets that were made in the U.S., the training of the School of the Americas by U.S. military personnel onto Latin American soldiers, specifically Salvadoran soldiers. They went on to commit some of these atrocities. But on the other side, CRISPAZ began a project in 1984 where we brought mostly people from the United States down to El Salvador. And they came down to be in solidarity with Salvadorans. I believe that solidarity is how God is present and how we as individuals relate with one another. And specifically when people from different cultures relate with one another. I think that is when solidarity really comes to light. And that is what happened in the 80s when U.S. citizens were coming down to El Salvador. For whatever reason, I think the Army understood that the U.S. was sending the checks for what was happening in El Salvador. But for that reason, U.S. citizens were literally untouched in the U.S. And this continues to be, I think that has stayed as a tradition, let's say, nowadays. But we brought U.S. citizens, and they were placed in communities to serve as human shields. And CRISPAZ did that throughout the 80s. We brought volunteers who lived 2 to 3 years in these communities, and the reality of violence in these communities completely changed. So, as I said, you know, we have on one hand a lot of the issues where the U.S. was involved in one particular way that could be seen as controversial, to put it lightly. But on the other hand, CRISPAZ was also a witness to the thousands of U.S. citizens that used their citizenship as currency to protect life. And I believe that is one of the most beautiful things the people of the United States have done for Salvadorans specifically. And as a Salvadoran, this is something that I will be eternally grateful for. This is something I know I will take beyond the grave. The level of gratitude I have for the people of the United States who showed a tremendous amount of solidarity and put themselves at risk in order for their fellow brothers and sisters from a different country, in this case El Salvador, to live another day. And as dramatic as that may sound, it was literally to live another day. That's the way things were happening at that time. During the 90s, early 90s, the negotiations for peace began to happen in El Salvador. In 1992, the peace accords were signed. Very quickly, we realized that although there was an effective ceasefire, there was no peace. A document cannot bring peace. The signing of a document, regardless of who is brokering or the intentions that they're behind it, cannot bring peace to a country, especially when we had a country that for over 12 years, and previously to that, we had people who were very violent against each other, all of a sudden, think that signing of this document, we're all good. No, right? So we, as an organization, realized that we had to continue to accompany these individuals, and that's the way that we continue to work, trying to understand what this new El Salvador was about. Many people began to return to El Salvador, as you can imagine. Many Salvadorans left because of the war. And as this was happening, in 2001, we had a series of events. One of them was the free trade agreement that was signed on January 1. Along with that, we had the dollarization that took place in our country. That same day, January 1, is when it began. And on the 13th of January, we had an earthquake. On February 13th of that same year, only a month, we had a second earthquake. And those two earthquakes, although the epicenters were in different areas, I just showed you how small El Salvador is, the waves overlap. So they really put El Salvador in a very vulnerable situation. And specifically this CAFTA treaty, which is not the NAFTA, right? It's the CAFTA treaty. This is specifically created a dynamic in El Salvador that, along with the earthquakes, pushed many Salvadorans to leave El Salvador. And this is when immigration really kicked up into a completely whole new different gear for El Salvador. If we look at the 12 years after the free trade agreement, and we look at the 12 years of the war, and we put them side to side, and we look at the numbers of people that left, more people left because of the free trade agreement than because of the war. And although I know you understand what my words are, I want you to think about that. A war created less of a push factor than an economic treaty, an economic policy that is not socialist, that is not communist. It is a capitalist, neoliberal policy that created a bigger push than a war in El Salvador. We had, in certain moments of the mid-2000s, we had about 700 Salvadorans that were leaving El Salvador on a daily basis towards the U.S., undocumented. Why? Why? Because of the CAFTA? Why did this happen? I want you to imagine this notion that exists, and it could be in some places a little exaggerated, but I think there's a lot of truth into this. When Walmart goes into a community, it forces a lot of small stores out of business because the reality is that they cannot compete with that business model that Walmart has, right? So you hear the mom and pop stores closing. So I want you to think of the CAFTA as a Walmart coming to El Salvador, but on steroids. It came and it devoured smaller companies that employed 1,000 individuals, that employed 500. I knew two people who had companies that one of them employed like 700 people and the other one about 2,000 or so. And what they produced, they could not compete with the prices that the CAFTA was now allowing them to kind of have. So a lot of these companies began to close as early as 3 months into the year, 4 months into the year. They were really out of business. And as of July, we began to see numbers that we had not seen before. At the beginning, there were numbers similar to the ones of the war, but then the numbers just continued to grow and grow. There was a point in that period that we were losing 1% of our population every 3 months. And we are a country of roughly 6 million Salvadorans. That's a lot of people for El Salvador. 1% of the population, regardless of where you are, it's a lot. So these events have created a different dynamic for Salvadorans today. The U.S. is a country that has been built over generations by migrants that have come here, right? But it's a story that goes back a few generations. In our case, it was just one generation. This began to happen in 2001. These people are still around here, right? This is relatively just a few years ago. And the DNA, right now we just came into the building. There's some DNA at the bottom. It just reminded me of that, because that's actually how I describe this part. The DNA of our country completely changed with, as much as an oxymoron. If anyone's studying med probably could say, you can't change the DNA, right? But figuratively speaking, our country changed completely in the last 30 years. And it began with the war, without a doubt. In 1980, according to the U.S. Census, there were 94,000 Salvadorans living in the U.S. 1981, the war began, and in 1983, according to the U.S. Census, there were 700,000 Salvadorans living in the United States. Today, San Salvador, the capital where I live, is where most Salvadorans live. The second city where most Salvadorans live is L.A. It's not even close to a city in El Salvador. So there's an origin there. We are now close to 2.5 million Salvadorans. I heard the word Cubans here at the beginning. Cubans used to be the third largest Latin American minority. Now Salvadorans are the third largest Latin American minority in the United States. So the numbers of Salvadorans coming up here continues to grow and has continued to happen for many years. So one of the things that we highlight and do, and we use our resources and platforms, is to give voice to the people who are affected by the CAFTA. And it's not so much the people that leave, although we talk about that, but what happens also with the people that have stayed. The free trade agreement has brought jobs, without a doubt, and many of them, but they're all sweatshop type jobs. These are jobs that have questionable benefits. If they do have benefits, the payments are very hard, and the demand what's being demanded of them is really hard. These are jobs where you have to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and you're clocked by how much time it takes to go to the bathroom, and things of that nature. So they're, and I say this very carefully, but they're somewhat of modern slave type work. There are different conditions that are different. They can go to their homes at the end of the day. They have a bit of a salary, but the conditions are really, really bad. And we can, if you have specific questions about this, we can talk about them. But something that has also been affecting El Salvador and has been pushing people to come to the United States is something related to what you're seeing here today. And this is, as you can see, you have Central America somewhere in the middle. I think there's a pointer here, and I think you can recognize where El Salvador is. But El Salvador is, where is it? Oh, there it is. El Salvador is roughly around here, and these three circles, I guess you know what they are, right? They're hurricanes. El Salvador would be hit by one of these major ones every 7 to 10 years, depending on the cycles. We would get one of these big ones, right? One every 7 to 10 years. Sometimes we were lucky, and it would be 5 unlucky, and we would get 5 years. But normally 10 years, more or less, was the length between these. As you can see here, this is just from a few years ago. These are 3 major hurricanes that were in that same year. So climate change is something that as Salvadorans we are not hypothetically speaking of. And I would say more than Salvadorans, Central Americans in general, we're not hypothetically speaking of what could hypothetically happen if climate change is not addressed. Climate change has been in El Salvador, and it has been a real thing for many years. This is creating now climate refugees. Many people that are forced to leave their places of livelihood because of droughts. It's, this creates a lot of rain, but the type of rain it creates is dangerous, and it's not one that helps with the crops. So we are now looking at cycles, at least in El Salvador, a 3-year cycle where you have individuals who sell off. And when you talk about farmers in El Salvador, in the context of El Salvador, it's different because they're not subsidized by the government. And these are people who grow just very little for themselves, their family, maybe for someone like their mother and things like that. So these individuals are being put now in this 3-year cycle where you have the first drought. They have a little bit in stock, so they can keep living that same with that for a year. The second year, they are forced to sell what very little possessions they may have. They have a TV, they get rid of it, they buy it. They buy food. If they have a refrigerator, they get rid of that, and they buy food. If the third year there's a drought, that's it. They are that's it. They have no more things to sell. There's nothing they can do, and they have to leave mostly to the capital. In the capital, there aren't jobs, and eventually they start moving up north. One of the most recent caravans that left Honduras was because of an area that was devastated by the hurricane. And it wasn't a drought, but it destroyed the area where the crops are grown. So we now have climate refugees, if the other things weren't enough. And this has been a reality for many years now. One of the things that for us is extremely important in looking at these experiences is understanding where we are and what we need to do to engage in this in a better way. And one of the issues that we propose is that we want people to go in with this idea of listening to understand versus listening to respond. From the very beginning, CRISPAZ began working with this concept called reverse mission. And the idea there was to look at the mission aspect of this trip, if you will, not beginning when people arrived to El Salvador, but beginning when they returned to the United States. That's when we wanted people to start really looking at their mission trip to begin. We wanted people to come to El Salvador and learn. We don't need labor in countries like El Salvador or countries like Central America. In Central America, we don't need people to come and build things for us. We don't need people to come and tell us how to do something. The reason why certain countries in Latin America are living the way they do is because of structural components that are bigger than what you can imagine. It's not because Salvadorans are lazy or we just don't know how to fix things or how to do things. It's really, there are structural components that are in place here. And for us, it's extremely important that people listen to understand versus listen to respond, which is something we are very accustomed to. Sometimes we don't even wait for the person to finish their full idea, and we jump in there and we interrupt. So these experiences are meant to put you in a position where you are doing just this. And understanding that these cross-cultural experiences are very important in how we, as we bring them back, how we reduce the hostility of the dialogues that we have around various issues. I want to talk a little bit, and as I finish, one second, about two groups of women, mostly women, that I've had the fortune to work with, and sometimes I don't know what word to use for work, because for me this is a calling. This is something I do for a paycheck. It's my life, and although it's work, right? But it's more than that. I've had a relationship with a group called Cofamide and Comadres, both in different contexts, but both show a side of El Salvador that I think is really important. Cofamide is the committee of family members who have been killed or disappeared on the way to the United States, mostly. undocumented migration, and it's made up of family members whose brothers, sisters, mothers, son have gone missing or have been killed. And so this is a recent one. And Comadres is an organization that was founded in 1977 with the idea of looking for their sons and daughters who had gone out after being organized and going out to protest in the streets, went out one day and never came back, or were taken as they were going to work and never came back. So I want to share, just as I begin to close here, a little bit of this. In the past 11 years, as executive director of CRISPAZ, I've witnessed how the Salvadoran people have shaken and inspired the lives of so many participants on the delegations. But what does radical hope mean? This was at the beginning of the presentation was radical hope, right? So what does radical hope, what does it mean? What does it feel like? For me, in my case, the people of El Salvador have helped me answer these questions without a doubt. I've had the good fortune to sit in front of Radical Hope when I've met with these people. I've had the honor of meeting these two groups. The first one is called Comadres, which is on your right. And the second one is, like I said, COFAMIDE, the Committee of Disappeared or Killed Migrants. Comadres was formed by mothers whose sons and daughters had been captured by the Salvadorans' death squads during the Civil War in the 80s. To this day, the majority of these sons, daughters, the list is in so many ways really big. It wasn't just sons and daughters; it was uncles and aunts, et cetera, et cetera. The majority of them have never been found. Their children were being persecuted for publicly protesting the injustices of the military regime. These mothers encountered lies, violence, and death as they searched for their sons and daughters. Some of them were tortured themselves. Mother Alicia, these are the comadres, they went out and this was their uniform, I would say. They would dress up with black dresses and a white handkerchief. This is what would happen sometimes in communities. They would see how their children were being taken away by the army with guns, and as you can see around the people in the picture, they don't have weapons. And it happened, which is very sad, and throughout our history, the people who have been most affected by the violence, the war, by natural disasters are people like them, the most poor in my country. They were taken like this, many of them at the same time. You have the National Guard there that would come and round them up and take them. And the result was many mothers would be looking for their kids. These are pictures of some of the children that they, to this day, continue to look for. This is Madre Alicia, as we called her. She was one of the founders of Comadres. She lost two sons. One was only 12 years old, the other was 16. She was captured when she was 5 months pregnant, and the tortures that she received while she was being pregnant, they were so violent that she had a miscarriage while she was being tortured. And I've had, like I said, the fortune of meeting this person and sitting in front of her and hearing her testimony. And it is one of the only way you can describe how you feel after hearing something like this is that your soul hurts. There's really no other way to describe it. But like I said, she had a miscarriage in prison, and it was like this for many of the mothers that you saw in the pictures there. But this did not stop them. They kept on denouncing the injustices and accompanying other mothers with a radical, persistent hope that they would be heard and that they would find their children. COFAMIDE was formed in 2006 by family members who left for the U.S. and from whom they never heard again. These families, primarily mothers, are searching for the relatives. Many put themselves at risk. Many family members put themselves at risk by traveling to dangerous places, confronting at times dangerous individuals, drug cartels. They find mass graves, indifference from the society in some cases, and also from government officials. But they do this with courage, and they do this with the hope of learning what happened to their loved ones. They still have that hope that they will find their son or their daughter. They do this with that hope in mind. Anita Celaya, this is Anita. Anita Celaya is looking for her son. Anita Celaya's son left for the United States on May 2, 2002. So you can do the math there. She is still looking for him as if it were just yesterday that he left. Like many young people, he left trying to travel to the United States undocumented with the hope of finding a job. In the case of Anita, he wanted to help his family get out of poverty with the money he would send back home. And that was the reason why he left. Anita knows that he traveled across Guatemala, arrived in Mexico, where he disappeared, and she never heard from him again. Anita has traveled herself the migrants' footsteps from Guatemala to the American border, scrutinizing every corner in search of her son. She started to look for him, like I said, by herself. As a mother, she has been trying to find him since the day that she no longer heard from him. And she, whenever you meet with her, the one thing she says, I will never give up looking for my son. Anita is one of hundreds of mothers who, like her, are searching for their family members who have gone missing on the journey to fulfill the American dream that for many has turned out to be the American nightmare. What these women offer us today is a powerful message of radical hope. What makes their radical hope isn't just what they hope for. It is what inspires it and what grounds it. What enables them to believe that things can be different. Certainly what inspires them, and what inspires anyone who has hope is something we feel in ourselves and in our humanity. But at the same time, it is more than that. It is something that enables us to hope when, humanly speaking, there is no reason to hope. Radical hope opens us to the Spirit that acts in and through our humanity. And so for these mothers, radical hope was never about doing something that was sure to bring results. It was about not giving up. It was about doing what was right simply because it was right. Hope in such desperate situations can only be a radical hope. My work has allowed me to be close to people like these mothers, people who make me more human. They have shown me the unjust reality that most people in El Salvador have lived with, and have taught me that to address the specific causes of the injustices, we have to challenge the status quo. When we learn what these people have lived and died for, we find ourselves empowered to follow their example and to hope even when there seems no reason to hope. They offer us the gift of radical hope that will lead us to prophetic action, to resisting the status quo and the system that is causing the injustice. It will help us find courage to speak up and resist, even when doing so will be dangerous. But how can we sustain this radical hope and prophetic action? We do this through contemplation. I believe that there's a Buddhist principle that I strongly believe in, and it is that when one encounters an injustice, one needs to be careful not to contaminate the response with that anger that one feels when that injustice is there. So how do we do this as people of faith or Christians? We do this through contemplation, through prayer, meditation. We nurture our radical hope in our spirituality, in our prayer life, in reflection, in what we call the mystical awareness of the Spirit that we feel in private meditation or in community gatherings and prayer. Contemplation without prophetic action can be self-centered and not go anywhere in terms of helping others. But prophetic action without contemplation or reflection can slip into hatred or violence or end up in burnout. We need contemplation to sustain both radical hope and prophetic action. Where does this ability to hope and keep acting when the opposition is overwhelming and nothing seems to change come from? This comes out of faith, out of what we feel inside ourselves. Together with others, such faith grows in a community. We sustain each other in this interconnection of our connectedness. Such spirit energy leads us to prophetic action that may require that we make political choices and take positions. This is something that's so difficult to do nowadays when we're told not to mix politics with religion, or when we confuse disagreeing with being disagreeable. When we respond to issues such as migration, we are responding to those who cry, migration and climate change, we are responding to those who cry out for justice. It is an example of how Christians are to follow Jesus in today's world, a world in which millions of people are suffering. As Christians, we must recognize that we live in a world filled with numerous groups and communities who are facing systematic oppression, and we must act. We have to be willing to identify and engage with the complex realities within our world that create such problems. To commit ourselves to radical hope and prophetic action is a matter of who we are as disciples and followers of Jesus. It is not a liberal cause or a populist agenda or a main street fad. It is a deeply spiritual practice. So as I finish here, I just want to share with you why we talk about the war, the events of El Mozote, Rio Sumpul, Comadres, and a lot of these events that could seem as very violent, and as anyone who has a small sense of psychology knows that reliving trauma is not necessarily a good thing, and the war is a very traumatic event. The reason why, as Salvadorans, and in my case as someone who's representing El Salvador, the reason why we share these very not so pleasant stories is because we truly believe, and we have this radical hope, that people will understand the importance of nonviolence and how we deal with the issues and how we fix the issues around us. We live in societies that truly believe that going to war is a solution, and El Salvador wants to share with anyone that's willing to listen what a war does to a country. Nothing positive can come from something as ugly as a war. Nothing positive came from something as ugly as the war in El Salvador. So we feel that it's our duty to share, like I said, with whomever's willing to listen, to understand the importance of nonviolence and how we create change and how we engage in dialogues. El Salvador today is becoming very polarized. I am aware of what's happening in the United States as well. And I think we need to find ways of de-escalating the arguments rather than taking them up a notch. And that's what it seems to be. It seems like the end game is to see how far we can take things. So El Salvador is an example of what happens when extreme positions get to a point where tolerance becomes the new normal, or the lack of tolerance, that eventually led us, in this case, to a war. Polarization isn't the end game. That's not where things end. So I want to thank you again for the invitation. It's been nice. It hasn't been warm for sure, but it's been really nice to be here in Indianapolis. Once again, I've been here twice, and thank you for the invitation again. Muchas gracias. Or comments? you. I just want to make a real quick comment. I was in the United States in November when President Trump was elected into office, and a lot of the people that I hang around with were not happy with that decision. And I was actually in the United States 4 days after the election had taken place. And I remember visiting Washington, D.C. and seeing I went out to do shopping and things like that, and all the shopping centers were really nice. And I went to several, and they were really nice. And then I visited Scranton, Pennsylvania. There's a Jesuit university there who we have a relationship with. And then I went around, and the story there was completely different. The story of going into those shopping centers there, 60% of the shopping center, like a big shopping center, was empty. And you can see that the economy in this part of the United States was not present, to say the least, right? You can see it was really a rundown city. You could feel the depression. So it helped me as someone from outside, and I hope people here do this as well, and there are other issues more complicated that we can talk about, but at least in that specific moment, I realized that there wasn't one reason why people voted for President Trump. There were various reasons why this had happened. And it did that for me. It allowed me to listen to a different side of the story of what was happening in the United States. It wasn't about racism only. It wasn't only about bigotry, or it wasn't only about white supremacy, as sometimes it's made out to be. Some people don't align with these issues, but they have felt forgotten. So that's just to kind of reiterate what you said. You know, the importance of listening to the other is extremely important. It's an exercise that requires a lot of patience, a lot of love, but I think at the end is what really moves us forward. Yeah, well, the sweatshops are a love and hate relationship because they do bring jobs to places that there are no other types of jobs, right? But there's a lot of power in that relationship. The governments allowed these people to park in, free zones, no taxes, so there's no benefit to the country. There are benefits to the individuals who own the parks because they lease out, and they are the ones that pay taxes, but that's a different thing. The problem with this particular type of work is that the conditions are, like I said, are very undesirable, right? The money they get from these sweatshop, for performing that labor is also very, very little. There are 3 different levels of minimum salary in El Salvador, and they fall under the second one, which is a little bit under $350 a month. And they have to be working there, from 9 to 5, just regular schedules, but $350 a month. That's a little bit under that. It's like $327, something like that. That's what they get paid. Funny enough, today I'm wearing a North Face jacket, and we all know these aren't maybe the most expensive clothing brand for this type of weather, but they're not cheap. This is made in El Salvador, it's manufactured in El Salvador, but this is the labor that's used to make this is paid very, very little. And I know that in economics there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be paid, the moving around of the goods and all that stuff. So it's not that everything stays to the company keeps. But one of the things that I think has been really interesting, to answer your question, is that in the 2000s there was this notion, and I think this still exists, whenever we learn that a certain company is doing something bad, the immediate reaction by those who are aware is to boycott the brand. We need to create a campaign to boycott the brand. So we would create spaces for these women, safe spaces for these women to come and speak about the conditions. And the groups would say, no, you know what, we're going to go back and we're going to boycott this brand. We're going to raise awareness so we can boycott the brand. And the women would say, no, please don't. If you do that, we're going to be left out of a job. Why don't you write your athletic department and let them know if they were using that brand, and let them know that you are aware of these conditions, and then have them write the company. So a lot of interesting things began to happen that way that have helped address the issue. Boston College is the school that comes with us, and as you know, they have a big football program and just an athletic department. So they did that, and they wrote letters to Nike, to Under Armour, one of those companies, but Under Armour, Nike, All-American is a brand, Hanes, Fruit of the Loom, the North Face, some Tommy Hilfiger clothes is made there. But it's a long list of clothes that are made there. So rather than boycotting these brands or just shaming them, I think more strategic and better thought out campaigns need to be done to call them out, but in a way that is asking them to address the issues. Because one of the dangers is, if it's not done right, is that they just close shop and leave and go elsewhere. And there are two things that happen there. Salvadorans, many Salvadorans, the majority of the women, the majority of people that work at these sweatshops are women. 95% are women. So you have those women who are now left without a job. That in itself is a big issue, because one of the things that's helping bridge that gender gap or empowering women in the household in a area where there's a lot of machismo, a lot of sexism, is that they are able to have a little bit of money, and they don't have to ask their husband to give them for the bus or for anything. So that little job, as significant as it could be for other people, is huge, because it empowers women to not have to depend on their husband, right? So all of a sudden, that's lost, and that dynamic of machismo and violence is started all over again. And the second thing is that you just push this, you just push the can a little further, and you give this problem to another country. So it needs to be done well, right? It needs to be done. Obviously, the economic power is here. The consumers are here. So it needs to be done here, right? Yeah. I think there are personal choices that one can make without a doubt. There are, we all have computers, or some of us have computers here. There are people who go on these cycles of trying to get the newest Mac when it comes out, or phones when the newest iPhone comes out. So these are things that we can definitely start changing in terms of climate change and the injustices that happen around these things. I didn't mention this, but the carbon footprint of El Salvador of Central America is so small that if we were able to eliminate it by zero, it would still make no difference, because we are affected by what happens in the global north. So things of that nature are extremely important. The cell phones, like I said, not buying the next iPhone as soon as it comes out when you still have a perfectly working cell phone is extremely important. Buying locally, I think, is extremely important. It obviously helps the economy, the local economy, but knowing where your clothes is made is extremely important. And I say that after I said this, right? But all these little things are very important. There are like To give you a personal example, in El Salvador, Coca-Cola uses 2 liters of water to make 1 liter of Coke, right? So I used to drink a lot of Coca-Cola, and I was, I would say addicted to it, and I've tried several times to get off it, and I would get these headaches from withdrawal system and things like that. But I don't drink coffee, so that was the caffeine that I needed. But I knew of these things, so I needed to, if I'm being serious, I need to stop consuming this problem that is taking water from communities that barely have any water. So I started to learn more and more about this, and I just felt ashamed to drink Coke because of what I was doing in my work. So little things like this. One of the things that I've learned in the work that we do is that when we look for change, we want these big things to happen. And we just, you mentioned the athletic department of Boston College, which is a big part. But we lose sight of how important it is for individuals to make a change. I think before we go out, we need to look at ourselves and see if we are accomplices of what's happening around us. And one of the things I tell people when they come on these trips is that these experiences aren't meant. They're not material for you to go and lecture people with. These are more for what it means for yourself, more than like, hey, did you know that in El Salvador there are 10 people who, et cetera, et cetera. So the individual change, I think, is extremely important, and these are things that we can do on our own and begin to learn more and more. I think education is an extremely important tool for change, for any type of change, and allowing others to have access to that education, and not just having these opinion-based arguments that have no facts in them. But again, I think globally, shopping globally, locally is extremely important for issues of global change, global climate. Ultimately, you as U.S. citizens have something that very few countries in the world, at least in Latin America, have, which is the ability to organize and contact your representatives. That is something that as simple as it may sound, it's something that I can't do that in El Salvador, and not because I don't want to. It's just I can't. There's no way for me to do that. There's no platform or vehicle for me to do that. So for you to be able to get together with people who are like-minded and write letters and send or even speak to them, that is, I think, extremely important.
Maybe a last question. What has to happen in El Salvador, politically or economically, to become better?
Education is something that previous governments, even this current government, is just not really investing in. So education, we have a large part of our population who barely do sixth grade. So education and not only teaching them how to read and write, but really teaching them, engineering, how to innovate, how to do different things. We don't want people who barely know how to read and write to come in and just continue doing what's being done. So I would say education is a huge factor in this. The other, I think, important aspect that needs to be addressed is how the international world reacts around what's happening in El Salvador. We don't need people to see as interests. We need to see people who can see us as partners in how we move forward, and that's been a big problem with El Salvador. People that come in see their interest being at play, and the investments are done with those ideas in mind. So looking at El Salvador more like a partner is, I think, extremely important. Corruption is an issue that needs to be dealt with in El Salvador. Latin America has a lot of that. There's a bit of that here, but it's completely different. The corruption in El Salvador has kept us from really moving forward. And I think it's because of the lack of education as well. The lack of education doesn't allow us to put the right type of people in power. So, given that we are in a school, I think it's, I say this, you are in the right place to change things. Education is the key of, for me, the key aspect that we don't have. Costa Rica, if any of you have been to Costa Rica, is right next to El Salvador, and the infrastructure of Costa Rica is not as nice as the infrastructure of El Salvador. It's beginning to grow in their areas where expats from the U.S. live that are very nicely built. But in general, the infrastructure in Costa Rica is not as nice as the infrastructure in El Salvador. And that is because, but their GDP, everything is much, much higher. And this is because Costa Rica decided to invest in education. They decided to invest in technological aspects, in technical careers, and El Salvador has not done that. So, education.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Soto, please stay and answer any questions you may have. But I thank you guys so much. Remember, in just a few weeks, we will have our last series of this year. So thank you for being here. Stay well. If you're one of my students, go home with your homework. And I will see you guys all later on.
Stay warm and healthy, everyone.